really impossible to talk about South Sudanese politics without talking about oil. I mean, this is a country whose entire path to independence was more or less based off the fact it was a petrostate. The politics in the country soon after independence heavily revolved around who basically controlled this oil revenue. And a lot of it was, basically disappearing. Even though the government is still receiving a lot of money from oil revenues, very little of that oil actually finds its way to the national budget. So what happens to it produces up to about 170,000 barrels per day. About 60% of that goes to the oil companies themselves, the Chinese, predominantly Chinese and Malaysian companies who produce the oil in South Sudan. And then that leaves South Sudan with about 40% of that, which is still a substantial amount of revenue. Out of that, 28,000 barrels per day go to Sudan at the moment, or at least it's technically supposed to pay off what I call basically the divorce settlement between Sudan and South Sudan over how to handle the oil when South Sudan split off. You have unknown amounts of diversions that go to the state-owned oil company Nile Petroleum, often called Nile Pet. By law, you have 5% of that money that is supposed to go to the actual oil-producing areas so that they get some benefit from this. In effect, audits of that money have shown basically the money is not going to the ground. A lot of it has been misdirected, so that money is disappearing that way. You have money which is going to pay the debt they've taken on by pre-selling their early oil rights. So some of the production that's coming in now is paying off previous debt. So then you have a portion of money, 10,000 barrels per day, 30,000 barrels per day, it's sort of fluctuated, that is siphoned off directly to special projects overseen by the Office of the President. These are infrastructure projects. And that money has been subject to a lot of allegations of corruption and mismanagement. So by the time you get to the budget, you're really left with a trickle of funds, and it's difficult to even figure out how much it is that's coming in. But the fact the government can't even pay its own workers indicates, how little is left by the time we do get to the budget. And we think the heart of the problem is really that the oil money coming into the government is disappearing. And this really comes down to why we even decided to write this report. So we really zero in on everyone sort of rallying behind going back to South Sudanese law and what's promised in the peace deal, and that's that the oil that's paid to South Sudan go to one single oil account, and that is a public oil account. And so at least at a top level, you can see how much oil money is coming in, and then that money can be traced back to a budget. South Sudan's made so many numerous commitments for financial reforms. There's over 60 of them in the peace deal. There's a smaller set that they've promised to the International Monetary Fund. The problem with that is that basically people want everything from the government, and in fact, they're mostly getting nothing. If you don't fix the problem that the oil money is disappearing when it enters the government and they're not even accounting for how much oil money they get, it's really hard to see how to proceed forward.
This is South Plus, and today we will be talking about South Sudan oil and its revenue. So let's get down to it. According to reports, South Sudan has the third largest oil reserves in sub-Saharan Africa, with roughly 3.5 billion barrels produced annually. Experts believe that 90% of the gas and oil reserves are still untapped. So how much money do you think South Sudan makes with the 10% of tapped oil? South Sudan currently produces roughly 150,000 to 170,000 barrels of oil per day, according to estimates cited by the International Crisis Group. However, it only earns income from 45,000 barrels, after the share owed to international companies and fees paid to Sudan. So as of 2022, South Sudan earned $1.4 billion in gross oil revenues, of which $1.1 billion went to direct transfers and $148 million were paid to neighboring Sudan as cost for processing, transportation, and transit fee. That answer may seem a bit not satisfactory, and that is because I'm not yet done with what is going on. According to the oil and gas journal OGJ, Sudan and South Sudan collectively held proved oil reserves of 5 billion barrels as of January 2022. Most of the crude oil in Sudan and South Sudan is produced in the Muglet Basin and Meli Basin. Now, for those of you who are not paying attention keenly, when I started, I said South Sudan produces oil worth of 10% of oil with 90% untapped from oil is not where it's supposed to be like from the beginning of the video. Sudan having 5 billion barrels still don't get watch the first 3 massive revenue for South Sudan worthy of trillions. With all that oil, South Sudan is still poor compared to most third world countries. And here is why.